Welcome to the Nicole Osei Report. I'm Nicole Osei, and today we're going to be talking about something an estimated 9 million Americans say they've experienced: a brush with heaven or the other side via a near death experience. And while all of the recounts are different and specific to the individual, a lot of them say it changed their life for good and it made them more spiritually open. And I'm very excited and honored to be joined today by neurosurgeon and best-selling author, including of the book Proof of Heaven, Dr. Eben Alexander. Welcome.
Well, Nicole, thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you today.
All right, Dr. Alexander, I want to talk about eventually spirituality and the importance of meditation and your book Proof of Heaven. But I think it's important to start at the beginning of your journey in this realm. Can you tell me what happened in 2008 that completely changed your life?
Well, important to point out, up to that point, I'd spent 54 years of my life honing, a conventional scientific worldview. I taught neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School, thought I understood something about brain, mind, and consciousness, but I admit I was kind of sucker punched into the prevailing conventional teaching of materialism or physicalism, which means you must somehow force the brain as a physical device to muster up consciousness. And believe me, that is a giant problem. Anyway, my kind of catalytic conversion that occurred in November of 2008 involved going deep into coma over just a few hours on November 10th, 2008. And the coma was caused by a very severe case of what's called gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis. So about the worst kind of meningitis you can have. And the reason it's important in this discussion is it's probably the most perfect model for human death, because meningitis attacks the outer surface of the brain, the neocortex, which is the part that's ultimately responsible for all the details of our conscious awareness. And by wrecking that, your consciousness should go to zero, as most materialists think happens when the brain dies. But in fact, in many ways, the exact opposite happens. It's a liberation of conscious awareness. And that's what I was about to experience. And for me, it involved a journey that, for one thing, was atypical from other NDEs because I was completely amnesic for my life. I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life. I had no words, no language, no memories whatsoever of humanity, this universe. It was an empty slate, which only in the months and years after my coma did I discover was absolutely essential for me to get some of the deeper lessons of the journey. Now, it all started for me in a place that I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm, but I was led up through a musical portal of light up into a much richer, ultra-real realm that I call the Gateway Valley. It has many Earth-like features. In many ways, it's kind of like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. That would be the place where we would go through life reviews, for example. Your life flashing before your eyes, as many people report in these kind of cases. And so that's why it's important to point out that ultra reality that is so difficult to describe is part of the fact that realm is completely beyond Earth time. It is not slave to Earth time at all. And that's why we can witness birth, death, everything in between simultaneously. And it gives us knowledge through kind of interactions of all these events in our life that goes far beyond what we glean from just kind of living it forward. So anyway, but to keep this short enough so that we can discuss it all, the best part about that aspect of the journey was that I wasn't alone. There were thousands of beings in the meadow down below, dancing, joy, merriment, festivities, incredible birth, all of it being fueled because of angelic choirs swooping up above, emanating chants, anthems, hymns, thundering through my awareness. But the best part was there was a beautiful young woman beside me on the butterfly wing. And those who've read the book Proof of Heaven will realize how crucial her presence was and her identity, which took me months after my coma to even discover. And her message to me, I think, was a central message of this entire journey. And that is, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You're richly cared for. And a bit of my backstory that's important to mention at this moment is that I was adopted. My birth mother was 16 years old, unwed. I was put up for adoption, stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months before she signed the papers to really let me go. So all of that is my back history, and it plays a crucial role in the much bigger story, because this NDE was my finally getting resolution of that question of whether or not it was even worthy of existence, because my own mother had left me behind. Suffice it to say that the NDE very satisfactorily answered that question in an affirmative fashion, and that beautiful woman on the butterfly wing turned out to be incredibly important later on. In fact, there was a lot of up and down after the the events of the spiritual journey and trying to figure it all out, especially because if I had scripted it, first and foremost, my adoptive father, who had passed over 4 years before my coma, he would have been there. He would have been that guardian angel, and yet he was nowhere to be found. And we explain all that, not just in Proof of Heaven, but especially in the follow-up book, which is called Living in a Mindful Universe. And that book really goes the big distance in bringing science and spirituality together and showing how, as a scientific mind, I can come to see all of this as part of a deeper reality that is important to all of us. Now, getting back briefly to my story, because I do want to have time for discussion, that was not the final place of my journey. I ascended to higher and higher levels. I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time, this material world collapsing down, all of that rich spiritual realm that's governed by an entirely different set of kind of temporal rules and causality. In the spiritual realm, all of that collapsing down as I ascended through yet another light portal, again associated with music, this time with the music of the angelic choirs above, entering into a realm that I call the core. Core was a resolution of all dualities. It's a realm that many NDEers never really get to. They sense a boundary. In my sense, in my experience, I felt like I passed through that boundary into this realm of pure oneness. So that in our world, you've got masculine, feminine, dark, light, good, evil, all these spectra of possibilities. And in that core realm, all of that is resolved into oneness. I came to recognize that my very conscious awareness was sourced in that God force. So this is not the ego mind. Let's leave that far, far behind, because that has nothing to do with this journey. But higher soul, I was witnessing the connection of my soul with basically the soul of the universe, or mind of the universe, God mind that so many NDEers have described, that is made them realize there's nothing to fear about death, and that our existence as eternal souls is much grander than just one birth to death incarnation. At any rate, many different lessons taught there. I don't have time to go into all of it. They're very much involved. But I would cycle back down to that earthworm eye view, just spontaneously tumble back down from this highest spiritual level of the core realm all the way back to where it began. The good news is, by remembering the musical notes of the melody that had first ushered me up into that gateway valley, by remembering the musical notes, that brought the light portal back to me, and I could again reascend into that level. Always welcomed by the beautiful guardian angel, and then always then seeking additional lessons through a journey to the core through those angelic choirs. Anyway, there came a time when all of this no longer worked. I'd been told the first time I entered the core, you're not here to stay, you're going back. And then there came a point where I tried to, by remembering the musical notes and measure of the melody, to conjure up that light portal back into the Gateway Valley. It didn't work anymore. To say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but the reality is I knew I could trust, just as that guardian angel had told me, just as that God voice in the core had promised me this kind of eternal connection of love and of wholeness. I knew I could trust in all that. And that's what happened, was I ended up coming back to this world. The last two kind of sets of memories. One is I was surrounded by beings going off into the distance, and their heads bowed, some holding candles. There were thousands of them. And there was this murmuring energy coming from them. And I was back now in that place where it all began, the earth from my view. But now I was getting this beautiful, loving energy from all those kind of that murmuring of all these beings around me. And what I called that in my writings weeks later, as I was trying to record all this and make sense of it, I called it the power of prayer. And that's what was kind of drawing me back to this world. And then the final vision I had in the NDE was of 6 faces that would bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words and disappear. My amnesia would feel very powerful, so I didn't understand the words at all. And I didn't know who these faces were. And yet it turns out that within hours of that, I was coming back to this world. And it had to do with the last face I saw. That was the most important in many ways. Reason I mention these faces is because they serve as what are called veridical time anchors. They were of people who were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 to 48 hours I was in coma. So they helped to prove that the vast majority of the spiritual journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of the 7-day coma. That's very important. That timing is mentioned in both the Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. And so at any rate, what happened was, and one of the phases, I don't have time to go into it, but she was not physically there, but she channeled to me from 120 miles away. If you had asked me before my coma about channeling, I would have said it's nonsense, doesn't exist. Obviously, it does exist. She was right there as present as anyone else. And I knew that that realm was completely non-local. So it was no surprise whatsoever to find out that Susan Wrenches, which is her name, the channeler, that she had never been within 120 miles of my hospital room, but that didn't matter. She was still very present to me, helping to draw me back to this world. But it was the last phase of those 6 that's most important. It was a 10-year-old boy. I didn't recognize him at the time. It was my son, Bond. That name is far more appropriate than I'd ever realized. But they'd protected Bond from the worst news during most of that week. But now, on day 7 of coma, doctors held a conference with my family. They said I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival early in the week, now down to a 2% chance of survival on day 7, but with no reasonable chance of significant recovery. And that's why they recommended stopping the antibiotics and letting nature take its course. And that's what they did. But soon thereafter, that's when Bond overheard this horrible, time to let him go, came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids, one eye over there, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows what a terrible picture that is. But at any rate, he was pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. As if somehow that would make it so. And it was really the only terrifying moment of the entire journey. Because up until this time, because of the amnesia, I had no sense of any kind of responsibility or duty to come back to this world to do anything. I was just observing all of these lessons that I was being taught about how it all works. But in the setting of that amnesia, where I didn't have Eben Alexander's personal memories to perform a life review. But I saw life reviews in a gigantic generic form in what I call the Ender's Net Vision, in one of those core journeys. Where I saw not only life review, but reincarnation. And I'd never realized before the strong scientific evidence for reincarnation, like, for example, out of University of Virginia. But it's extremely strong and very compelling evidence that our souls come back again and again. But the reality is that the doctors who have assessed those cases, and at UVA, it's more than 2,500 cases, they've examined past life memories in children. And of those, 1,700 have solved. That is, they actually found the identity of the person who lived before, that they truly lived, that these children weren't just dreaming this up, but that it was a real evidence of being reincarnated. But by age 6 or 7, those memories are naturally being covered over. So the rest of us don't have ready access to memories of past lives and between lives. Occasionally, those memories come to the fore through hypnosis, through NDE, through meditation, what have you. There are ways to recover past life memories. But for most of us, they're not part of our existence. And I think that is just a statement about the current stage of human development and the kind of lessons we're here to learn and teach. And for whatever reason, the current arrangement in our culture, at least, is that these memories are forgotten, and therefore we have skin in the game for this bodily existence, birth to death being our one incarnation. But in truth, we're souls, eternal souls that come back again and again in a process of growth, maturation, and transformation. Now,
that's right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But I wanted to ask you before because I do want to get into that more. You were talking about when you were, I'm going to use the word ascending, and you were experiencing, you said, a loving energy, you were going through the core, and all of the things that you witnessed and maybe felt that are beyond the realm of maybe human explanation, the way that we can understand it. But are you able to kind of talk more about what your soul was feeling, if that's even the
The
right word to
feelings
use?
were
Because I'm sure it's
everything.
bigger than a feeling.
Well, the emotional stuff is very real and solid. And in fact, what you find is the ultimate coin of the realm is love, period. And that's what NDEs tell us by the thousands, by the millions in these stories. And that can be NDEs from all walks of life. For example, even, in a prison hospice setting, you find that love is the thing that's so important. And of course, people can have many regrets about not manifesting love. And that's what a life review is all about. It's a course correction that allows us to make amends. But ultimately, the deep and profound and powerful lesson is it's the binding force of love that's the most important guiding force of any of our existence in this universe. And that is a lesson that this world needs to learn big time. And that's why it's so important that the current science of consciousness, especially with the spearhead uh, of near-death experiences and related experiences like after-death communications, shared death experiences, which are just like near-death but happen in perfectly healthy people. Also, the hospice community, people who actually die, you get the very same kind of story. So we realize all of this is telling us about kind of a common journey that we have as human beings. Excuse me. But that it all ultimately is about learning these lessons of love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance to take care of each other. That's really what NDEs and what this big science of consciousness is trying to teach us.
And speaking of acceptance, because I've read your story and others who were talking about what they went through in their NDE, and I wanted to ask you, when you came to and you're processing this experience, what was the defining moment that made you realize that this is something that really happened? Because some people may walk away from that and they're kind of not sure.
Well, I was very not sure. For one thing, it seemed way too real to be real. That's the way I expressed it to my son. Because to me, the memories were so sharp, detailed, memorable, alive, dynamic. It was much more powerful than even lived events in this life in a physical body. And my doctors, as I woke up, my amnesia is still in process. As I said, it took about 2 months for my neurosurgical neuroscience knowledge to all come back to me. So early in the experience, early on awakening from coma and trying to explain it to my doctors, well, they just said, well, we don't even know how you're coming back to us. We thought you were going to die. But you can forget about whatever you experienced because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So we all believe our doctors, and I didn't yet have all my neuroscience knowledge back. Plus, I did not yet know the amount of damage to my brain. I hadn't yet dove deep into my medical records. But as all that's happening in the weeks after my coma, I start going into medical records, my CT, MRI scans, et cetera. And, as I mentioned, I've originally told my son 2 days after I got out of the hospital. He was majoring in neuroscience at the time, and he knew that every time you revisit a memory, it changes. So he was the one who told me, write everything down before you read anybody else's NDE account. I'm glad I did that. I wrote about 20,000 words, and only then did I dive deep into the NDE literature. And that's where I started realizing, oh my gosh, there were so many similarities. You can tell, kind of, it's almost between the words, you recognize the stories these people are sharing. And I sensed a big commonality. In fact, many people wrote to me after Proof of Heaven came out and said that the language and the kind of way I set up the story in Proof of Heaven reminded them of something that in many ways they'd forgotten. So it reawakened soul memories in them of deep, between life and past life type experiences, things like that. So in other words, there was big up and down, initially telling Eben it was way too real to be real, so it couldn't have been real. Well, guess what? It was way too real to be real because it really happened. And just because all the data and further analyzing my medical records and the neurologic exams, the Glasgow coma scales, the lab values like my cerebrospinal fluid glucose level, the sugar level in my spinal fluid, which in you or me would be 80 or so. In somebody in deep coma with bacteria chewing it all up, it might drop to 20. Well, in my case, my glucose level in the spinal fluid was 1. And none of the consultants had ever heard of such a severe case. So obviously the bacteria had run out of glucose to eat. They were just devouring my brain. Now, of course, any neuroscientist who sees me today would say, well, you can't have been that sick because look how well you're doing. Well, guess what? That's the important point of not only in the book Proof of Heaven, but in a medical case report on my medical records by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery, which was unprecedented in the medical literature. They wrote up a case report. It's in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018. And they make it very clear that that brain was too ill to be doing things like processing dreams or hallucinations. There was no place in my brain for that to happen. And that's what shocked me as a neuroscientist, because I had the experience. The experience was undeniable. I initially tried to kind of deny it based on our typical conventional thinking that it had to be a hallucination or dream. But then when we get into the medical details of the case, especially in that case report, you find that doesn't help you at all, because all it does is demonstrate that brain, my brain, was incapable of having any kind of dream or hallucination, much less this most profound experience that I ended up having, and then being committed to memory. So it was a very profound mystery. And it was only 4 months after my coma when I got a picture in the mail from my birth sister, from that from the birth family that I had met 1 year before my coma. And she promised to send me a picture of our younger sister who had passed over back in 1998, 2 years before I even found out about her existence. And when I saw that picture, I recognized that guardian angel. And that was an absolute mind bender. Once I brought me to my knees, I couldn't even stand up for 20 or 30 minutes. I was in such shock. And it's almost like she's looking at me saying, do you finally get it? and the picture was actually taken 3 weeks before she passed from this world in 1998. It was taken out in California, and I still have that picture. And that from that moment on, I knew, oh my God, no wonder it seemed way too real to be real, because it truly happened, actually in a realm that's much more real than this world. And so anyway, from that moment on, it was just working as a scientist to acknowledge, yep, these things are real. They're not dreams or hallucinations. How do we explain it? And that's what I've spent the last 16 and a half years trying to do with hundreds of other scientists around the world.
Do you find that you still have a connection? And I believe her name was Betsy, correct?
Yes.
Do you find that you still have a connection with her, and do you still seek to have a connection with the experience that you had in terms of that side of things?
Well, I do. And I'll point out that, initially as, this of academic, Harvard neurosurgeon, my approach was to read books and to look at DVDs and talks and talk with people, et cetera, to try and figure it out logically, rationally. And I read about 150 books in the first 2 years after my coma. I knew quantum physics was deeply involved, but I kept hitting a roadblock. And I realized if you want to get to understand this more deeply, you need to meditate. You need to go within. For me, meditation and centering prayer are the same thing, identical. So for me, meditation is a form of deep and profound prayer. And I encountered something called binaural beat brainwave entrainment. I encountered it through a Scientific American article by Gerald Oster in the early 1970s. It's called Binaural Beats in the Brain, that illuminated the anatomy in the lower brainstem, which is why this stuff is so powerful. And then the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, was co-written with my wife, Karen Newell. And Karen is the co-founder of a company called Sacred Acoustics. And then people can learn a lot more about that at sacredacoustics.com. But basically, it uses binaural beat brainwave entrainment to help people get into very deep transcendental states of conscious awareness. So you can learn more at sacredacoustics.com or from the book Living in a Mindful Universe. Also, a great avenue to learn more about all this is at the ebenalexander.com website. There's on the welcome page, there's a 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. If you click there on the 33-day journey, put in your first name and an email address. For 33 days, you'll get an email every day covering one of the major topics of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But this 33-day journey is completely free. It's been taken by more than 12,000 people over the last few years. They all leave their comments, so there's a community forming on each page of that 33-day journey. But that 33-day journey also involves 4 different sacred acoustic sound files that are available for free right through the 33-day journey. So I strongly encourage people who want to get into meditation, want to learn more about all of this, to do that. But for me, I meditate every day using sacred acoustics, an hour to a day. I've been doing that for more than 11 or 12 years now. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, going within. And the power of this is that you're letting go of that ego mind, the little voice in our head. Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls the voice in your head your annoying roommate. That is a very good way to look at it. It is not your consciousness. Your consciousness is the awareness of that voice. But the ego voice, in many ways, is a very primitive little superficial construct, that kind of assembles a lot of stuff in this realm and helps protect this body and usher it through life. But ultimately, our awareness is something much deeper and grander that actually expands when we die, when it's liberated from the shackles of the brain and the body. But we can come to know that as a truth through meditation long before we come to the end of our physical lives. And that's why I encourage people, meditate. Start becoming familiar with that primordial mind, with that higher soul aspect of yourself, and putting that silly little ego voice into timeout. The ego, its main tools are fear and anxiety. And the ego is absolutely right at the heart of all addictions. And addictions can move beyond alcoholism and drug addictions. People can be addicted to sex, love, addicted to work, exercise. Addictions can really kind of wreck our life and kind of make us dysfunctional. And this is why connecting kind of with our higher soul and getting a deeper sense of our existence that goes beyond the petty little ego mind can be very important. And we do that through meditation. Sacred acoustics allows us to leave that ego voice behind.
And I agree with you. I meditate regularly as well. And I've had spiritual experiences since I was a child, but I didn't start meditating until maybe I was in my early 20s and became more spiritual. And I've heard people say that, just in conversations, they say that, when it comes to meditation and intuition, and when you're trying to have that connection, that the more that you do it, the more your higher soul, if you will, or some people say guardian angels, however you want to quantify that, they say that you should listen to that, and you can get in touch with that more. And the less that you listen to it, the quieter that voice gets. And you'd mentioned earlier about what that actually was, whether or not that was our conscious, and who that voice was. And I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that, as you're talking about telling more people to meditate, and so that they can kind of get an idea of what they should be listening for and how to tap in. And whether or not that's real or not for them, because when it first starts happening, it can be a bit jarring at first.
Well, for me, I like to kind of use the language of, it's like trying to get into a lucid dreaming state or a hypnagogic space. Hypnagogia is the space between awake and asleep. And of course, for most of us, we hear that word and we say, well, it's kind of hard to navigate what's happening when I'm between awake and asleep. But that's exactly the space we're trying to get into. And we can do that by focusing on the breathing. So going into meditation, listening to Sacred Acoustics audio files, because they're a very important tool, because they cause an oscillation down in the lower brainstem. And many of us are used to the concept, say, if you hypnotize somebody with a pendulum, it's eye movements going back and forth following the pendulum. that induce that transcendental state. And so a left-right oscillation down in the midbrain, that's what's going on there, or with eye movement desensitization reprocessing, that's EMDR. It's a very successful mode of treating post-traumatic stress disorder. But all of this involves these oscillations in the lower brainstem, and sacred acoustics is actually more powerful because it's going a much deeper level, more ancient level of the brainstem. 300 million year old circuits, if you look at evolutionary biology. And that's where this powerful oscillation has an influence on the activity of the neocortex and its interaction with the deeper thalamic structures. I'm not going to go into a lot of neuroscience about this, but ultimately what you're trying to do is, with a strong oscillation in the lower brainstem that's induced by listening with headphones or earbuds to these two sound channels, that is what is allowing you to relax, to put the little voice in your head into timeout, and then start getting into this hypnagogic space. So for me, when I do a meditation, my ego mind, my voice in my head can state an intention, make a request, ask a question, but then it goes into timeout, because what I've learned to do is put that intention out there to the universe. But then I just use the tones and I focus on my breathing, and I start getting into that hypnagogic space where you no longer have the little voice in the head guiding where you go and what you think. But you can expand that. It can get to a state called non-self, or a clear light state. These are very, very profound, deep states of no longer having any kind of clear connection with the body. But in that beautiful kind of drifting hypnagogic space, that's where the universe can start to answer that question that you put early in the meditation. You put out there, like, what do I need to know right now? It could be that general a question. But then when I've learned to ride the sacred acoustics tones, get into this deep hypnagogic space, my little ego mind is in timeout. And that's when the universe starts to offer up answers. There are many creative people in history who have learned to get into that hypnagogic space for creativity. Albert Einstein did it. He used to float around in a sailboat staring at the sky, and he would come up with these brilliant ideas that just weren't there from plodding along the rational, logical, thinking your way to an answer, but he would get these flashes of insight. Thomas Alva Edison, one of the biggest inventors in history, founded General Electric and had hundreds of patents. And when he was in the inventing mode, he would sit there at night when he was very tired, and he'd hold some weights in his hands, and when they drop, he'd have these little micro naps. And after 3 or 4 micro naps, he'd have that insight. The universe would give him the answer he was looking for. Robert Louis Stevenson, the famous novelist, Scottish novelist, poet, musician, he used to get all of his big inspiration for that creative work from something similar to what Einstein was doing. So the ways to get into that transcendental state is very important for creative people, for coming up with new insights into difficult and challenging problems. And that's why, I can't be strong enough in recommending the power of meditation. And for people who need a tool to turn off the little voice in the head, the little monkey mind, to get to a meaningful intersection with the universe, and with this primordial mind being able to feed us the information we're looking for, sacred acoustics is a very powerful tool.
I couldn't agree more, because a lot of people, when I talk about meditation with them, they'll say if they're in the beginning stages, they have trouble quieting their mind. That's the most difficult part. And some people, I always say, like for myself, I started with 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and just kind of increased it until I could get to that point. And it got me to thinking about just the relationship to body, mind, and soul. And some may focus on the body, some may just focus on the mind, but I feel like there's a lot of people that forget about the soul aspect. Can you talk about why that trinity is important?
Well, to me, as a physician, as a healer, I always say that any physical, mental, or emotional health and healing ultimately is spiritual or soul-based. So in other words, looking at it all as kind of connected from the top down. There's one of the biggest problems with our materialist science is we try to pretend that just by understanding how all the subatomic particles, photons, atoms, molecules that make up all the stuff around us. If we understand how all that works, then we can understand how events occur in our reality. And what that is missing is that the only thing we're not experiencing some naked objective reality. That's a deep lesson of quantum physics. What we're experiencing is a heavily filtered dashboard that refers to information that can be important to us in living these lives. But ultimately, we're not experiencing some naked reality. Time itself emerges with consciousness. Time is not fundamentally built into what's going on in this presumed objective reality. In fact, there is no objective reality. It's all subjective when you get right down to the deepest aspects of it. And yet we seem to have a common shared world. And this is where the idea of the one mind is so important. These kind of discussions in scientific circles, what we're coming to realize and to have for the last century or so been working on is the notion that consciousness is fundamental, that in fact, conscious awareness is something that generates the emerging physical reality, not the other way around. And this is where mind over matter is so important. And once you realize that kind of unification and top-down causality and influencing the emerging nature of what we experience here, you start to realize that that is a mental system. It's not a physical system. So any kind of healing, emotional, mental, etc., is ultimately going to be a form of spiritual awareness and kind of consolidation and oneness in sense of meaning and purpose. For me, that's what the word spirituality means. It's for one thing an acknowledgement that we're sharing one mind. So our brain we should look at as a transceiver or a filter that allows in a little eddy current of that primordial mind. And when we're alive in these bodies, we kind of think, well, that's our consciousness. It's not shared with anybody else. And yet the evidence in parapsychology for non-local consciousness, for example, telepathy happens in about 35% of identical twins. It's very powerful. Read Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy, and you'll get it. Another person who was a twin is Larry Dossey. He's a good friend. And he and his twin married identical twins, and they had a lot of twin experiences. And Larry ended up writing a book. It's a very smart physician. He wrote a book called One Mind. And that book talks about the one mind and the brain as a filter. Our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is another excellent source of this whole modern scientific notion of the one mind hypothesis, that we're all sharing one mind. That becomes very obvious during an NDE when your mind overlaps both with people who are still alive, even though they could be thousands of miles away. That's what happens in a shared death experience. But your mind also intersects with people who have already left the physical plane. So, souls of departed loved ones. So all of that becomes the material of near-death experiences. And when you study these scientifically, you realize that they're teaching us something very profound about the soul and about our ability to heal ourselves and bring ourselves into wholeness. So as a healer, as a physician, I would point out placebo effect. That's a starting point, but that's an acknowledgement over the last 7 or 8 decades in scientific studies that beliefs, thoughts, and attitudes can have a powerful effect on healing and wholeness. So we know it, we admit it, we've seen it. We may not be able to explain it, but mind over matter is built into modern medicine, beginning with placebo effect, but then you can move on beyond that to spontaneous remission. And for example, if you go to noetics.org, Institute of Noetic Sciences website, put in the search term spontaneous remission, you will find a book they published, I think in 1993, by Carol Hirschberg and Brendan O'Regan. And that book covers more than 3,500 cases of people who had advanced cancer, infection, what have you. All these things had not fully responded to medical treatment. So they were in deep trouble. The cancer was progressing. The infection was trying to kill them. And then they would do something else. And that something else, I know in 6 of 9 cases of what I'm going to discuss in a second, it was spiritual factors. So Kelly Turner wrote a book based on that same Noetic Sciences database of the 1,000+ cancer cases. Her book is called Radical Remission, but that's where she illuminates 6 different spiritual things that people did in those groups to successfully cure themselves of the cancer, infection, or what have you. And those things were like fostering positive emotions, processing negative emotions, adopting a more spiritual approach to life, meaning and purpose in life being identified, things like that. Very spiritual features are what led to this incredible healing. Now, Helene Wabe, who works out at Noetic Sciences now, is redoing that database with another 30 years of data. That'll be an amazing thing to see. I can't wait to see what Noetics and Helene come up with. But the evidence is there that spontaneous remission is a part of our ability to heal through prayer, through meditation, things like that. Now, then we can move beyond placebo effect, spontaneous remission. The big category is miraculous healing and near-death experiences, like my case. And that's something that the medical case report on my medical records makes so very clear, was that you would not have expected me to end up making a full recovery. That just isn't in the cards in the medical literature. And yet I did. Over 2 months, as I said, everything came back. And so in many ways, in fact, when that case report was submitted, the peer review editors of the scientific journal challenged the authors and said, how do you explain his recovery? It's unprecedented in the medical literature. And they said it's because he had a near-death experience that he was enabled to have such a miraculous healing. They knew of other cases like Anita Morjani, who had an advanced lymphoma. She had a profound NDE, and she made a choice to come back to this world knowing that the lymphoma, the cancer, would disappear, and it did. Likewise, Dr. Mary C. Neal, an orthopedic surgeon, she wrote a book called Heaven and Back. She had an over 30-minute warm water drowning and kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s, was brought to the surface dead, and yet she ended up recovering after resuscitation and going back into orthopedic surgery, but also, like me and like Anita, going around the world sharing our stories with other people. But there are many of these stories out there in the NDE literature of miraculous healing. And the big message to all of us is, as spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, we have that power of kind of spirit over matter to influence our health and well-being. And you can sit there and not believe it. And if you don't believe it, you're very unlikely to reap any of the benefits. But if you believe it and start pursuing it and see the possibilities for healing and wholeness in your own life, it's amazing how much starts to come true and how much the universe comes to help and rescue us. And again, the key thing is love. If you're a conduit for love and you bring in love and compassion and kindness from the universe into this world, and you share it with your fellow beings, the universe ends up reflecting that back to you. And so that love starts to become something that you receive, not just transmit. And it's a beautiful kind of sense of karma, of sharing,
Definitely.
and how this world can work much better. And that's the deep message to any and every one of your audience listening today, is that you have the power to really become the soul that you want to be, that you came here to be. But you need to spend
Tap
time
in.
visualizing that in meditation, but then also live that life. Because it's not just about spending time in the spiritual world in meditation. It's about what we do, the choices we make, and how we live every breath to breath in this material existence, in my interactions with my fellow beings, and in the way that I see myself and deal with myself. All of it must involve this kind of bigger vision of possibility and belief in the power of love to heal.
You kind of touched on these skeptics. You had said something to the effect of, if they choose not to believe, they're not going to believe, but they're not going to reap the benefits of that. And I kind of wanted to touch on that in terms of what you want people to walk away with, because there are people that have experienced this and they are believers and they practice this in their lives. And there are people that it's hard for them to wrap their brain around this. For what do you say to those skeptics? What do you want them to walk away with listening to this? And then what do you want people to walk away with who already believe this? They've had a brush with it themselves.
Okay, for one thing, let's first of all set the stage. Make it clear. It is no longer a valid question whether or not the afterlife and reincarnation are scientifically validated parts of human reality.
Mm-hmm.
That's been settled. Now, if you run into somebody who says, oh, no, that's all woo-woo nonsense, steer them to bigelowinstitute.org. That's a website that has 29 essays on it written 4 years ago by professional scientists in the field of afterlife studies around the world. And those 29 essays come from many different directions, but they make it crystal clear there's no longer a position of materialism or physicalism to say, oh, the brain creates consciousness, our existence is birth to death and nothing more, and anything beyond that is woo-woo nonsense. That viewpoint that I just made has been totally disproven by scientists. bigelowinstitute.org is your resource. And so if some scientist comes up to you and says, oh, this is impossible, there's no afterlife, all they're telling you is they're willfully ignorant, that they're either lazy or don't care enough to read those 29 essays. Once you read any of them, start with Jeffrey Mishlov's first place essay, you'll realize that the question has already been settled in the affirmative. The afterlife and reincarnation are absolutely real parts of human existence. So that's a starting point. But then what it really takes is belief and trying things on, trying it out for yourself. Now, you'll get plenty of benefit from sacred acoustics, even if your goal is something as simple as relief of anxiety. There's a pilot study that came out in January of 2020 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. She's a New York City psychiatrist. And what she found is by people listening to sacred acoustics tones, that they, over 2 weeks, they'll have a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms. That's compared to only a 7% reduction in the control group who only got standard psychotherapy over those 2 weeks. So just by listening to sacred acoustics, these people had a tremendous increase in their ability to feel at peace and calm. Relief of anxiety in our modern world is, a worthy goal to have. But that's just the beginning. That relief from anxiety is because you're connecting with that healing aspect of yourself, the higher soul and primordial mind. And as you start doing this, try it out. See how, meditation enhanced with sacred acoustics, binaural beats, changes your life. And also see what kind of evidence the universe gives you in meditation. And again, as I said, the goal is the little voice in the head can make a request or statement early in the meditation, but then you want it to go into timeout. You don't want that little voice nagging at you when you're trying to meditate. And the meditation is very intentionally trying to just follow your breathing, just breathe in and out, just focus on the now moment, no concerns, no worries at all. And just breathing and riding those tones. You'll see what I mean when you listen to them. And again, use headphones if possible, headphones, earbuds, because you want to split the signal into both ears. But what you find by trying this, and we've demonstrated this in many of our workshops, and you can go to the testimonials page on sacredacoustics.com to learn a lot more about what people have, what benefits they've gotten from these kind of techniques. But the more you try it, the more you realize that it's quite easy to get into that hypnagogic space, a very kind of deep meditative calm space. And it's at sometimes, if it's your intention, for example, to recover past life memories, you blank your mind enough into this hypnagogic space that the universe starts to then feed you things. They're kind of to me like dream seeds. So it will feed a very real scene. And, I can notice it or not, but if it seems familiar, I might pay attention. And then in the meditation, ask, for more guidance. Why is this important? What else do I need to know about this scene and its importance to me? And the more you do this every day and you do it weeks and months and years on end, and you start getting this incredible library of experience of the universe trying to teach you soul lessons that go far beyond what your little ego mind and your voice of rational, logical thinking is accomplishing here on Earth. So you start getting a lot more benefit. But the real power is in turning off that little ego mind and learning to navigate this space that can be as kind of broad and general, as I said earlier, of being a space of complete non-self, where there's no vestige of any kind of identity with the body or anything, but just this pure consciousness. And in its cleanest, purest state, that is called a clear light form of awareness. And it's one that in many ways is just filled with all the potential of the universe, but without any kind of nagging piece that kind of drags us down, but just this clear light consciousness. It's pretty much an indescribable state, but I've gotten to it through sacred acoustics meditations many a time.
Wow. And I just, there's a term that you use in their soul lessons. I do believe like that's what it's about. We are coming into this world as souls, and we're here to learn a lesson of that. And I hope people take your advice and do more, get into meditation if you haven't done that before. And if you are meditating, do it more often.
Right. And again, for anybody out there, it's a form of centering prayer. There in 30 years ago, there was a huge conflict between the meditative community and some religious practitioners. But now people realize that deep hypnagogic space, that meditative space, that prayer space is really one and the same. It's all the many different pathways to connecting with that primordial mind, the God mind, that's at the very source of our conscious awareness. So we're never really separate from it, but we perceive all these kind of boundaries between our, kind of rough and dirty physical existence in the material world, where we're the slave of earth time. And what you need to do is kind of develop that sense of the higher soul, the part of you that expands at the time of bodily death. And you can do that during this lifetime. So why, wait till the end of your life to kind of engage that kind of higher soul? But do it now, do it through daily meditation, do it with intention and attention, and do it with the goal of improving your life and your influence, bringing benefit to your fellow beings and to all of humankind. And the universe reflects that kind of energy back at you. So
it most certainly does.
Because I love, lean into it energy. Bring that love in, share it everywhere, and the universe will start showering you with love.
And I think that is a beautiful, beautiful statement. I think we will wrap it up there. And again, thank you, Dr. Alexander, for joining me today to discuss this. And I want to hear from all of you. Have you ever had a near-death experience or a spiritual experience that you want to share? If you have, comment down below. And if you like this kind of content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.